We're going to go back to working with procedural terrain and a lot of the different functions available for that. More specifically looking at some of the different fractal nodes that we have available. So I'm going to add in just a procedural terrain. And we're going to open up the terrain editor by double-clicking on the terrain. Turn off zero edges so we get rid of that fade and gradient around the outside. Make sure we don't double-click, and we can right mouse click and go to Edit Function. And if we go to our fractal node now, we've already basically covered the simple fractal, but I do want to show you the filter embedded within there. So we're just going to create a little bit of a filter for this simple fractal. And I'm going to reduce our scale so we can see a little bit more. And you can see the kind of terrain that's creating just with that little bit of a simple fractal, or simple filter. We can increase the creep in amount, and that's moving in through our filter and how we adjust that. And if you take a look at the gradient, you can see it a little bit better. And then we can move in the minimum value, which is going to be the left side of our filter. And we can start moving in through that curve. We can also set the max value, which is going to be the right side. And you can decrease the amount of that filter. So that's pretty cool, fairly straightforward. Go back to our basic repeater. And you can see we can turn on with rotation. And of course we don't have a whole lot of detail for our basic repeaters. And we can go through and select some of the different pattern options. And you can see that some of them do not have the ability to be edited, but some of them do. So we select our cracks, and we can go to Edit, and now we can adjust our crack width. Make them a little bit larger. And get some interesting looking effects. And then we have a filter that works with the minimum and maximum value, just as the other one did. And of course our combination modes for our harmonic behavior. We can get some different variations by using that along with the scale and how often we'd like to repeat. But let's change this to a fast Perlin fractal. And we don't have a whole lot of control over the noise of this one, but we can definitely create some very quick terrains and something fairly simple. And it processes a lot quicker than some of the other fractal nodes. So that's always available if you're going to be just needing really quick terrain, something you want to render very quickly, and if you don't need a whole lot of control over what you're working on. Now we're going to take a look at the variable roughness fractal. And taking a look at this in the terrain editor is really the best way to show how this works, because we can really see the overall effects. I'm going to change our wavelength and just scale that down so we can see a lot more of the overall surface. And this is going to work the same way with our materials, depending on what it is we're working on. I just think being able to see the altitude and the overall bump is something that's a little more helpful. Variable roughness is basically all the same settings that we have for our simple fractal, except that we have a new variable roughness box that's available. And this gives us a smoothing level. And we can see those variations showing up. We can adjust the creep in amount of that smoothing level. And I want to increase our roughness on the overall surface a little. Maybe not that much. And as we increase that smooth level, we can see that really showing up on the bottom more, where it's nice and smooth on the bottom and then slowly gets rougher at the top. And we can increase the influence of that, and we can see that start to creep up a little bit more. Change the creep in amount. We can bring that down. A lot more smoothing overall. And it's a very useful fractal node, just for that extra little bit of variation. And of course, we can change a lot of these different settings and extract their parameters. So I'll go ahead and zoom in, and I'm going to create another fractal to control the smoothness level. And I'm going to be using something that will stand out first. So we'll go to, let's go to line patterns and fabric. That's really going to stand out. And if we go to our main fractal with the variable roughness, and I'm going to change this one from a variable roughness to a simple fractal. And now we can go to our smooth level, and I'm just going to extract that parameter rather than going in there and waiting for the pop-up. Now you can see we have this constant node that's showing up, which is a constant number, and we're going to disconnect the constant number and connect that directly to this pattern. And we can see those smoothness values traveling through where you can see the pattern. And I'm going to decrease the wavelength so we can see that showing up a little bit more throughout the surface. And you can start to see those lines showing up. If we change this to something a little bit different, we'll go to math patterns and use the onion. Now you can see the onion lines showing. And we have a nice overall change in our smoothness level. So any of these settings can be extracted and connected directly to this node. Go back to our controller for our smoothness, and we could do some square patterns. Or we could change that to the Voronoi under cellular patterns, decrease our gain a little to show just a little bit more. And then I'm going to zoom in to our surface just a little bit. And we can see the overall variations caused by this specific fractal. So let's take a look at some of the other options that we have. We have a variable noise fractal. In this way, we can determine the variations with different noise settings. So we have a noise 1 and a noise 2. And you can see where noise 1 is typically over on the left side in part of the bass settings. We now have it in the variable noises section, where we can use multiple noise options in order to work on the same fractal. So I can change this to our Voronoi, and we can see that showing up. Of course, I need to adjust our scale because this is a very large wavelength for this. And now we can see that Voronoi pattern showing up for our noise 1 and noise 2. We can even make that exactly the same, and it will give us a nice little variation because they're kind of different sizes. And it's a way for us to place one noise on top of the other. So I can go to our Perlin noise linear, and we'll just start to see that showing up in those other areas. Let's go ahead and change that to cracks. And now we're going to see all of those cracks on top of our main noise. And I'm going to change that to a value gradient and go back to our noise 1. And we can change that to flat patterns clumps. And now we can see the two noises being put together. We can go to the drought function, which is a pretty neat looking noise. although it can create some very sharp lines, so whether or not you want to be using it for terrains is really at your own discretion. We can also use crystals. We can give more of a pyramid look. We can go to the water settings. It's kind of neat looking. Let's change that to the gradient. And now we can see, in order to show that a little better, I'm actually going to go back to the Voronoi. And if we take a look at some of the other settings, we have the switch level. So how much we're blending between the two surfaces, which one we see more than the other, is basically just a ratio. And then we can adjust the speed setting. And also our local influence. And I'm going to increase our scale, and we can take a look a little bit closer. And these can also be edited. If we go back to the Voronoi editing options, we can use the second closest neighbor, which is going to cut away some of our definition, some of our shape. Change that to smooth rounded, which is going to be sort of like adding the sine wave filter to it. But we can see we end up with a pretty interesting looking terrain. And then we can of course always add a turbulence node to that to make it even more interesting. This time I'm going to use the advanced turbulence, increase our amplitude, and then attach our origin to that turbulence. And we're going to get a very twisted looking terrain or material. If you're working with these nodes to create a material, they work exactly the same way because it's all basically black and white functions. The only thing that's different for the materials is that instead of modifying altitude, we're modifying color and bump and settings like that. Even this option that we have right here, we could copy and paste onto the bump of a material and set for displacement mapping, and we will end up with the exact same looking material on a plane for instead of using a terrain. So a lot of things we can do with it. We can also turn on the width rotation, and that's going to change it a little bit more. If I remove our turbulence and disconnect the origin so we can see that a little bit better with the rotation and then without the rotation. And then of course we can also modify a filter for that. We're going to move on, and now we have a 3-noise fractal. And I'm just going to need to change the size of the function editor. Now typically you'll be working with a lot higher screen resolution than I am currently recording with. And typically I work at about 1920 by 1200. So a lot of this is a lot smaller, and you really won't have to compress your resolution probably this small. And a 3-noise filter works kind of in the same way the variable noise works, except that we're setting different ratios throughout the entire terrain, or in this case just the fractal, because of course we can use this for materials as well, or anything else we would use any of these fractal nodes for. So we can change this to a Perlin noise gradient for our base setting, and then we want to adjust our wavelength so we can see it a little bit better, decrease our scale and the overall preview, and now we have our base setting noise. We have a variable roughness setting where we can adjust the smoothing level and our variable roughness, the creep in and local influence of that. We get a turbulence dampening. And you'll be able to see that a little bit better once we change some of these values, because pretty much right now it's all the same setting. So we're going to change this to a Voronoi for the mid-scale noise. And now we can see our mid-scale noise is that in-between value where we have the base setting is the overall terrain. The mid-scale noise is just in between that, and we can change the scale if we need to make it a little bit larger. And now our mid-scale noise is almost the same size as our base setting noise. And we could reduce that if needed. And we can just combine and multiply these different noise settings all together and get some really interesting looking effects. And if you take a look at the preview, you can see it a little bit better and how everything is working. I'm going to go to our preview options and set that to the 2D plane since it got changed back. And then we also have our small scale noise, which is going to be all the really fine details on the bottom. Of course, it doesn't have to be because we can change that overall scale. And these scales can also be modified and extracted. So let's go ahead and change this to a value gradient. Then we can go to Edit. And then we can adjust the ratio, whether or not we'd like it to be rigid. And we can also animate that one. If we modify the Voronoi, we can change the closest neighbor and also the overall shape of that. And we can see that showing up. And if we reduce our turbulence dampening all the way down to about 0, we're going to have sort of an equal influence on all three of our noises and how they sort of blend together. If we increase that amount a lot higher, it's sort of more of a contrast between each of the different surfaces, and really that depends on different scales. I can go ahead and increase that scale of our mid-scale noise. We can see some really neat looking variations. And it's just an extremely flexible fractal, and we just have a lot more options available for editing than we do with some of the other fractals. And what I'm going to do is just scale this back down, and I'm going to add a filter in here. And we can change that to a sine wave, and that'll bring out definition even more. And of course we can use combiner nodes and just anything you can think of to modify this. And now because of the resolution, I'm getting a lot of overlapping. Go ahead and reduce the size of the function editor once again. And now if I wanted to, I could adjust the scale of our mid-scale noise, and I'm going to extract that parameter. We're going to do something a little more different with it. Instead of just having that a constant value, I could adjust this, and currently, not to the slope. We have a little bit of an X showing up, which is showing us that we cannot connect directly to that. So we'll go ahead and delete that. We're going to go back in here, and this is a very large function, so it can be a little difficult to tell exactly where everything is at. Go ahead and zoom out, and we can adjust our largest feature based on time, have that change over time, use our constant number just to extract that. And right now we're not seeing the actual constant number, but if I click OK and we go back into the function, you'll be able to see that value. And we can also use the title and description on all of these as well. We could call this main number, and now the constant is going to show up as main number. And that's just kind of a neat thing you can do. You can title and add a description for all of the different nodes that are available.